how the economy has grown in 150 years, they would scarcely believe their eyes. They would scarcely believe that such an incredible increase in wealth was possible. But I tell you that when some of these ideas begin to break through and are implemented, then the economy can grow much faster than it has done in the last 50 or 100 years. There can be a growth in the economy that even the most advanced economists today would scarcely be able or willing to accept, because they would think, as they are programmed to think, that this would simply lead to such inflation that the economies would overheat and collapse. But my beloved, the inflationary cycle is a product of the power elite and the debt-based economy. When you transcend this, you can create an economy that can grow much faster without producing inflation. Because when you have a better money system, there will be no inflationary factor built into the money system, and therefore there is no limit to how the economy can grow without creating an inflationary spiral. A free economy cannot overheat, because in a free economy you do not create money artificially. You create money only to pay for goods and services. And if the money are backed by something that has real value, how can there be inflation? How can the economy overheat? And so, when you envision this tremendous economic growth, you can begin to think about what ramifications this will have on societies. For example, you can see that right now there is such an unequal distribution of wealth in the world that it is scarcely fathomable to us that people can actually live with this. We understand, of course, as we have said, that you cannot be concerned about every issue going on the planet. So I'm not talking about you individually, but I'm talking about the more developed nations of how they can accept this. And so as the economy begins to grow, you come to a point where you simply have no excuse for not raising the standard of living in other nations. And in fact, you can come to a situation where new ideas will be released in the nations that need it the most, rather than the ones who no longer need it. And so you can come to a situation here where very quickly the rest of the world will be brought up to a material standard of living that is closer to what the most affluent nations have today. This, of course, does not mean that the affluent nations will stagnate. They will also grow, but there will still come that point where there is less of a distance between the rich and the not-so-rich nations. This will change so many things that you see in the world, my beloved. There will be less disease. There will be no starvation. How could you even accept, in a matter of a few decades, that there are children dying from starvation every year? There will come a point where the world will simply wake up and say, how could we ever accept this? We certainly cannot accept this anymore. And many other things like this. And so what you will see is that there will be such a shift in the focus, in the sense of purpose. Why are we here on earth? Why are we actually here on this planet? Is it just to fight with each other and destroy ourselves in either a war or some environmental collapse? Or do we have a higher purpose? Well, when you begin to see that you have a higher purpose individually, you can of course see that you have a higher purpose as a whole, as the human race. And suddenly you begin to see that, at least in the short term, one of these purposes is to give all people equal opportunity to raise their awareness and live a fulfilled life where they feel good about themselves. Think about how many people in the world live in such poor material conditions that the concept of feeling good about yourself just seems like a complete pipe dream as a luxury they could not even imagine. When you are hungry, what does it matter whether you feel good about yourself or not? And so there will come that point where it is seen that it is our collective responsibility to create a planet where people have this opportunity. Now, of course, my beloved, you may say, well, what happens to war and conflict and terrorism and all of these things? Well, when you actually have the shift in consciousness, where people begin to see that you are not material beings, they begin to understand the basic dynamic of the power elite, then you will actually see that within a matter of a few decades, the world will move to a point where it is not that warfare will be forcefully eradicated. It is simply that the world will transcend the consciousness where warfare is seen as a solution to any kind of problem. And this will mean that there will be some nations who will dare to take the step to abandon the military, as I have talked about before. And there will actually come a point where all nations will have either no military or a very small military that has many other tasks than actually killing other human beings. You can have a situation where some nations will say that the money we are now spending on the military, we will spend on creating a force that can go into other countries and in the short term help with natural disasters or starvation, but in the long term help build that country, build the infrastructure, build a better economy, give the people a better standard of living. So that what you today see as the help to third world countries as a form of charity is now seen as a major task for the country, and instead of spending money on a military, you are spending on building other countries. And so all of a sudden there can be this shift where you recognize that if you are not a material being and you have the opportunity to raise your consciousness, as you raise consciousness, you will begin to feel that you have a basic humanity within you. You have a certain worth as a human being. You will begin to connect to the basic humanity in other people. And you will begin to see that these national divisions and other kinds of divisions will begin to fade away. And suddenly there can be, as we have talked about, this greater cooperation, this greater sense of community. There can be nations who decide to merge because what is the point of having national boundaries? And there can be the emergence of these greater regions where armed conflict simply becomes obsolete, unthinkable. This will take a little bit of time because some nations will lag behind. And the question will always be, when can the more evolved, the more peaceful nations abandon the military as a deterrent to those nations who are still at a lower state of collective consciousness and therefore could potentially commit aggressive action. But still, within a matter of a few decades, it is possible to reach this state where war becomes more and more of a remote possibility. It becomes more and more of a remote occurrence. And suddenly there comes this shift where people in many nations will stop feeling threatened. In fact, we were already close to this in many European nations before the situation with Russia invading Crimea and the turmoil in Ukraine made the countries of Europe go backwards and think now they need to increase military spending. And of course the United States is also lagging behind on this, thinking that it needs to maintain the biggest military in the world. How can it be, my beloved, that the country that in many ways considers itself to be the most developed and sophisticated country in the world is still so afraid that it needs to maintain the biggest military in the world. Does this make any sense to anyone? Certainly not to me. And so you will come to that point where it is not that terrorism will be eradicated or that rogue nations will be eradicated forcefully. It is simply that the consciousness will be raised. Certain fallen beings will be taken out of the 4 levels of matter by the ascended masters, and all of a sudden warfare will fade away as a realistic risk, and more nations will begin to see the need to step into an entirely different approach to life. And it will also be seen that those who can do this will again prosper financially. They will prosper in terms of the people's well-being and an increase in creativity. And so there are so many things here that can and will happen as the consciousness goes through this series of shifts that I envision, that it can be difficult for most people to even fathom that such changes can happen. And this is actually one reason why we have so far focused on giving you an awareness of the problem, because many people are still so focused on the problems that they are able to grasp that, yes, if there is to be a better age, we need to overcome this and that and the next problem. But there will be a shift that is perhaps more subtle than any of the others. And that is that people will begin to shift their focus away from the problems and shift onto the possibilities, the potential. And suddenly it will be seen that right now many people think that the problems are real and the potential is a fantasy, or at least very unlikely. But there can be a shift where people begin to realize that in a sense, from a certain perspective, it is the problems that are unreal, and it is the potential that has reality to it. It is the possibilities that are real. And this can lead to a shift which has already happened in many nations. There have been these gradual shifts up throughout the last century where the material affluence has been increased. People have, without realizing this, shifted into a more positive view of life, into a more trusting view of life. They have felt that perhaps they live in a more friendly universe than their grandparents did, and certainly a more friendly world. And this can cause this shift where people begin to actually accept that the material realm, the mother realm, wants to nurture them and give them everything they need in the material so that they can pursue the raising of consciousness. And this is again a very subtle shift that can have incredibly widespread impact on how people feel about themselves, how they feel about the world, how they feel about each other, how they relate to each other. Because suddenly, if you do not distrust the universe, why do you need to distrust your neighbor, especially when you experience that basic humanity in both yourself and your neighbor? Suddenly you will see that neighboring nations who have had conflicts in previous centuries, maybe even previous decades, nations who have had distrust of each other, suddenly this will dissolve, and they can scarcely understand how they used to look at each other with this distrust, because they realize that really, why shouldn't we trust each other? After all, we are so alike. One of the areas where this potentially could happen is among the 3 Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They are so alike in language, in culture, and in mindset. Once you see beyond certain national differences, you see that they are so alike in mindset. So why is it that nations such as Denmark and Sweden have had so many wars between them over the centuries, that the only 2 nations that have had more wars is England and France? This is a fact that many people in Scandinavia are not aware of. So why is this, my beloved? And therefore there is a potential, a very real potential, that the Scandinavian countries can suddenly step up to a higher level of consciousness and say, why are we distrusting each other? Why are we not cooperating more? And this, of course, can happen in other parts of the world as well, where there are nations that are very close to each other and that simply have been trapped in a spiral where they do not know why they do not trust each other. They just don't. And nobody's willing to stand back and say, does it actually make sense that we carry on this distrust that might have been reasonable decades or centuries ago, but is it relevant? Is it even relevant today? And so, my beloved, you can see how what I am attempting to give you here is an overall vision. We have made you aware of many problems. We need you to make the calls on them so that we can step in and do our part. But of course, I do not want you to think that the main process of manifesting the golden age is overcoming all of these problems. Even if we overcame all of these problems tomorrow, this would not automatically manifest the golden age. The golden age is something that needs to be co-created between people in embodiment and myself. It needs to be brought forth gradually so that people feel that it has not been dropped upon them, but they have played a part in manifesting it. And so they have a sense of involvement and ownership. And the greater part of bringing this golden age is to shift the consciousness. And when you shift the consciousness, the problems fade away. They are transcendent. Now, why do we need you to make the calls on these problems? Well, partly because we are having you make calls on raising the consciousness. But we are also having to make the calls that allow us to step in and bind and consume the demons and the entities and remove the fallen beings who are aggressively perpetuating the problems and have created them in the first place. You see that it is a two-pronged process. If you do not remove the dark forces, people will not be able to shift their consciousness into a positive approach. But when you remove the dark forces, this shift becomes so much easier. And when the shift happens, it is not that all of the problems will be solved in a linear way. It is not that the cause of the problem will be destroyed, as we have said before. But people will simply transcend the consciousness, and suddenly the problem either fades away, or people no longer focus on it because they are focused on the solution, on the possibility of manifesting a better society. And this is what will truly manifest the golden age. But it cannot be done as long as people's attention is pulled into all of these negative spirals perpetuated by the fallen beings and the dark forces. It simply cannot be done. Well, you could say that it can be done as it has been done over the past 2,000 years, but it will be a much more slow process. And therefore, what we envision is to speed up the process so that by removing these dark forces, people will suddenly wake up and feel free from this weight that used to pull them into all of these reactionary patterns and spirals. And when they no longer have this pull, they will be free to step back and say, why are we having this distrust? Why are we doing things this way? Why aren't we looking for better solutions? Surely there must be better solutions out there. And suddenly there is a raising of the awareness that yes, here is a better solution. And suddenly people will see that it is not a matter of forcing this upon society or forcing it upon other people. It is simply self-evident that this is the next step in the evolution of society. You see, my beloved, there are sometimes ascended master students who get so eager to bring the golden age that they would like to see it manifest in an instant, in some dramatic shift. They want to see these dramatic shifts so suddenly some miraculous event, such as raising the earth into the fifth dimension or what have you, occurs. And everybody now is astounded because of this seemingly miraculous event. But my vision is entirely different. My vision is a gradual process where instead of seeing this as some miraculous event, people see it as self-evident, as the obvious next step for society. And therefore they implement it with that level of awareness, with that approach. Not that it is dropped upon them from heaven, but that it is simply the natural, self-evident step to take in order to continue the process of manifesting a better and better society where people feel good about themselves. This is the vision I want to give you for now. I know I have painted with broad strokes, given you relatively few specifics of how this will be implemented. But do you see why? It is not a matter of defining that we need to change the economy, and therefore we need to implement this, that, and the next thing, so that we can map out a plan. No, it is a matter of raising the consciousness so that step by step, many different people in many different places suddenly see it as self-evident that we need to do this. That is my vision. In fact, in some way, I am perfectly happy to remain unknown to the majority of the people. I am perfectly happy to see the manifestation of the Golden Age without most people recognizing Saint Germain or thinking that all of these ideas are coming from. I am perfectly happy to have the majority of the people feel that, oh, this idea just appeared at the right time and everybody could see that it was self-evident, and that is why we implement it. This is what many people think about democracy, for example. But it didn't appear out of nowhere. It was brought from the ascended realm, and it was in fact a long process going way back into history to bring forth the current modern democracies. Many, many ideas had to be brought into the world before this could happen. But nevertheless, we are perfectly happy to have the people think that they came up with this because it gives them a sense of being involved, of being engaged. And my beloved, I am not looking for people to be mindless followers of this almighty Saint Germain, who is the ruler, the hierarch of the Aquarian age. I am looking for people to feel the creative flow through them and know that they are bringing forth something from within themselves wherever they see it coming from. This is my vision for now. Will there come a point where people will be more aware of the source? Yes, certainly. But I am in no rush to be recognized as the engineer of the Aquarian age, of the Golden Age. I am just happy to see the growth on this planet so that people can live more and more fulfilled, positive lives. This is my joy. This is my reward. Why would I need recognition or worship or adulation? My joy is to see people grow. There is no greater joy for an ascended master working with a planet like Earth.